Hey guys, welcome back. I have an action-packed, mega-packed episode today, and in true Jupiter form, the most packed episode has a lot to do with Jupiter and Jupiter moving into the Leo mansion, out of the Cancer mansion where it loves to be. I also wanted to intro this episode with something I've been wanting to add in, which many of my astrology faves do on their podcast episodes, which is starting the episode with an Ask Me Anything. So I sourced a bunch of questions from my friends. I'm like, hey guys, if there's something even personal about your chart that you want me to discuss on the podcast, submit, send away. And I will continue to do this on these episodes. So if there's something that comes up that I'm talking about, submit another question. I want to do this in the beginning of every episode. I think it really connects us all and shows us sort of, certain areas of interest that are coming up for us. And in addition to this Ask Me Anything, I'm going to, like I said, discuss a bit about Jupiter, discuss the stories behind Cancer and the moon, stories behind Leo and the sun. And these are two super major important placements in our charts. They are the luminaries in the sky. They are the super important givers of life and light that we revolve around and represent so many different cycles and sources for all of us. So this is going to be really exciting and hopefully very interesting and illuminating, to use an apt pun. I was talking about it with bestie Caitlin yesterday, and sort of the way in which she's become really interested in tarot, and we've been talking a lot about, how the tarot corresponds to Kabbalah and how we can, connect the tarot to all these different kinds of astrology placements, and working on a project together with that. So stay tuned. But we realized that we both really love looking at these systems and languages of symbols to sort of empower and remain curious, empower ourselves, empower the people that we're reading for to remain curious, and to show us what questions need to be asked and show us what things we might be struggling with, how we might be standing in our own way, but not in this sort of like fatalistic, deterministic way. And I talk about this every episode because it is so important to me in these spaces. And so many people come to me, I'm sure come to tarot readers, and they really want answers. But what we're going to discover, not only in this episode, but I'm sure in many episodes to come, that the answers are always within yourself. And sometimes we just need a prompt. Sometimes we just need a sort of like external little trigger to get us to see that. But like I said in one of my Substack articles, with tarot, with astrology, with transits, with things happening, guess what? The missing ingredient is always going to be you, your free will, and how you are able to cope with the tools and the situations that you've been given at any given moment in your life. So that's a huge theme on this podcast, in my practice, and we're going to get into it. There's going to be a bit of myth. I do not consider myself an expert on myth. I have always loved it. Shout out Disney's Hercules. That was my shit growing up. And so many of these stories relate back to Hercules. And I was like, wait, the way I've been obsessed with that movie since I was a kid. Shout out the McDonald's Hercules plates. I'm going to pop up a photo here. Shout out that. That was my favorite thing in the entire world. We had the Pegasus plate and the Hercules plate. That was a really special time in my life. And maybe that was what started all of my interest in these archetypes and stories and the connection of humanity throughout the ages, and how it doesn't matter how technologically advanced we get, we still find ourselves on similar journeys with very applicable experiences to the ancients and these incredible myths that they wove, the symbolism embedded in them. So we're going to get a lot into that. But without further ado, I'm going to get into my AMA section, Ask Me Anything. So I got some really cool questions, and they do sort of relate to some things I was talking about in the last episode And some things that I, again, really want to push, so I'm stoked to answer these questions for you guys. So the first one is, how intimate relationships can thrive if they aren't completely, quote unquote, compatible signs. The person who submitted this, I know, is talking about somebody that she actually has a sun-moon conjunction with. But this is an incredible question. So, and I think it's something that many people think about, especially when people are like, oh, I can't stand astrology. You know, people write me off because of my sign, or, you know, they say I'm so this and I'm so that. We can never be compatible or whatever it is. And that's just simply not how astrology works. There are, 20 to 25 markers in a chart that would connect you to someone. And like I've said previously, there are so many reasons why we are drawn to people. It might not have to do with our sun sign. It might not necessarily have to do with our Venus sign. There are many different markers in a chart that would draw you to someone. And like, I believe if you are drawn to someone, explore that and see what lessons and what emotions come up, and maybe just evaluate it later and see like, that is how I relate to someone. As far as synastry goes, which synastry is how you connect two charts together and see how they interact with each other, that's a really good tool for compatibility. Another one is creating what's called a composite chart. Creates a chart out of the midpoints of all of your placements together. So it like fuses the two charts together. And that can kind of tell you what you guys create together. You might have a Taurus rising and that's ruled by a Gemini Venus in your composite chart, and then, or you might have a Virgo rising that's ruled by a Scorpio Mercury in your composite chart. And that can be super illuminating and can unlock a lot of things. And then to go back to synastry, that shows how essentially your planets interact with their planets and points. So one thing that I tend to see a lot in relationship readings is there typically tends to be, guess what, nodal activations, especially when the relationship feels really, faded and like you're really drawn to them for some reason and you can't super explain it, or like, well, they came into my life in this super unexpected way. You're probably activating a north or south node point, if not both, in each other's charts. So without going in depth with any particular chart, like I said, I really like to look at nodal connections. I look at how the Venus signs are aspecting each other, the moon. Jupiter is a really huge thing to look at. How are your Jupiters interacting with each other? How are you guys able to kind of expand each other, or how do you guys struggle? Maybe you guys miss that expansion point and that can feel a little less exciting. I was talking to a friend this morning about how exciting Jupiter is in a compatibility chart, and something that kind of gets overlooked. And we will talk so much about Jupiter today. So it's going to be blah, 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 yap, yap, yap about this ultimate sky god, Jupiter. So aside from that, I do think that you might be dating, let's say, for example, you are a Scorpio and you find yourself dating a Gemini and you're like, whoa, this is like supposed to be so incompatible. But chances are in your chart, either you have Libra, maybe you have Sag, that would aspect the Gemini placements in the other person's chart really well. Guess what? In the Gemini chart, they probably have Taurus or Cancer in their chart, and that would aspect your Scorpio really well. So there's a lot of nuance to how we interact with each other on an astrological level. And like I said, there's always going to be a reason, and all you have to do is look into the chart and be like, oh, that's probably why I'm drawn to this person. That's probably why I connect so much with this person. And for example, with the person that submitted this question, they have a sun-moon connection. So her moon is in Aquarius, this person's sun is in Aquarius. And when we think about the sun and the moon, they have this eternal connection, right? This like one, our moon doesn't really exist without the sun's light. And the sun, anytime there's a conjunction, I feel like the sun really casts light on this thing, and the moon is a very private and inner and emotional space. Perhaps if you have a sun-moon conjunction, you're like, wow, this person really illuminates my emotions and like helps me understand and brings them out and sort of like brings them into my consciousness, and there's many different ways to explain that, but usually a sun-moon conjunction can feel very illuminating and bringing the subconscious into the conscious, if that makes sense. And those are pretty also, I think, nostalgic placements. I think the people that I have dated that I've had this connection with, and I've dated multiple people that I've had this connection with, and it feels very much like the person very much feels like home to you, because there is that connection to the moon, and there is that familiarity that comes with that connection, and that can be really, really lovely in many relationships. So it's not uncommon when you find yourself in a relationship with someone like that. But anyway, I could go on for a long time. It's way more interesting to look at the two charts in question, but just know that there's a reason that you are connecting with someone. I don't necessarily believe in incompatibility. I think that there are challenges that might not be worth overcoming if they keep coming up. But as far as like why you're drawn to someone, there typically is a reason. And book a reading with me and we can look deeper into that. So the next question comes, which relates a lot to the tarot discussion that I've been having with Caitlin lately. And another question that came in was asking about 0-degree astrology placements. So degree theory in astrology is really interesting. If you haven't looked into it, essentially every degree relates to another zodiacal archetype. So, for example, I have a 5-degree Scorpio Venus, and 5 is a Leo degree. And I'm very much someone who is a words of affirmation person. I want to hype someone up in my relationships. I want to be hyped up. I want to be sort of like creatively inspired. I want someone to, exalt my light, and I want to exalt their light. And that's very Leo-like, as well as like all of the Scorpio associations that come with the Scorpio Venus. But so it's really exciting to look deeper into your placements when you look at what degree is associated with what zodiac sign, to just add another layer. I always think about the more you learn about astrology, I picture when you're at the eye doctor and they start putting lenses on that start to bring things more and more into focus. That's how I think about all these different layers that we can put onto something, and you're like, oh, that adds that just extra bit of focus that brings clarity, When it comes to the 0-degree placements, I associate this with the Fool tarot card. It's the 0 card in the deck. It's all of this ultimate potential energy. You have just stepped off the cliff into something new, and there's so many different expressions of what this could be, and it's kind of up to us to take the Fool's journey to see where that energy can go. And again, to use my own placement, I have a 0-degree Jupiter, and it's the first step into Scorpio, and it's very new, it's very fresh, and it's very much related to how I feel like I think about Jupiterian things, which we're going to go deeper into soon. It's the first breath. It's the first step off the cliff, and we don't necessarily know where we're going to land, if that makes sense. I got a number of great questions, but I might save them for another episode. I want to focus on this question that this person who submitted it might not have been aware of how exciting this question was. I'm going to read it out loud. She said, "My dad and I share a sun. My mom and I share a moon." So she has her sun in Cancer and her moon in Capricorn, meaning she was born on a full moon. And then she says she has her south node in Cancer and her north node in Capricorn. So guess what, sister? This means you were born on a full moon lunar eclipse, and this is such an auspicious time to be born. It is very ancestral, because she also mentioned, she was like, yeah, it feels very ancestral. It makes me feel very, interested and connected to my past. And that's very common with a Cancer placement, but especially with a Cancer south node. And being born on an eclipse, just to roll it back, just in general, being born on an eclipse is a super potent energy to come into the world with. Like I mentioned in the last episode, eclipses are this sort of like swinging doors open, slamming doors shut. It's very intense. It's very faded. It's very much just like this energy was meant to burst forth, And when you are born on an eclipse, it's really common for eclipse seasons in general to bring a lot of change into your life. Yes, that's true for everybody, but especially because you are an eclipse baby. So the eclipse points in your life, we can go deeper in this in your own chart, but like looking back at like when eclipses happened, see how those were activating your chart and how intense those moments must be. I also want to add, must have been. I also want to add, being born on a full moon is very much, like I said in the last episode, just like this culmination and this ability to see things very clearly. There is also this essence of, yes, wanting to be fully seen, but also getting like this point of just like, we have achieved something and we can see it for what it is. You carry that with you in your personality, this sort of like fullness in yourself. And people who I know who are born on full moons have a very prominent presence. It's very magnetic. It's very much it's very exposing. It can feel very illuminating in your relationships to other people. You have a very strong ability to expose things that are typically kept hidden and kept dark. So this is a huge placement. And this is a friend of mine who has not let me see her chart, and hopefully we'll have her on the podcast because I'm now dying to see it. I'm like, this is such an intense placement. And she also has multiple 0-degree points in her chart, which I can't wait to discuss further. It's super exciting. But not only does this person have a lot of the Fool energy, like starting on your unique journey with so much potential, but you're born on this full illuminating moon and an eclipse. So your connection to the sun and the moon is so strong. She also mentions that she tends to get trapped in the south node. That's very common for us, especially when we have placements on the south node, and that's where her sun is. So typically your sun in your chart, in addition to Saturn, we kind of like grow into our Saturn placement, but that's because Saturn is this sort of like time taskmaster, time lord taskmaster. But with the south node, with the sun there, you are growing into your sun consciousness. That being on the south node means that you are bringing in a lot of ancestral consciousness from your masculine or, your masculine drives or your father's side. So there is a lot of just like things that have been absorbed from that side of the family typically that feel perhaps like way more comfortable and way more something that you're going to lean more into when you don't feel as secure and ready to go into that north node space. Like what I talk about a lot with the north and south node, the south node is what we're bringing with us. There's a weight to it, and the sort of synchronicity of it being in the sign of Cancer for you is very much like a deep ancestral connection to these stories and the people that came before you and brought you into this world that is very much within you and within your consciousness, embedded in your consciousness. It's super common to have a placement on the south node and get kind of stuck there. And it's not your fault. It's something that we're working to find balance with. And then I would say with the moon on the north node, there might be a sort of craving for that energy, that like desire to embody this Capricornian essence in your case, that sort of like hunger, that striving towards the north node. And then with the archetype of Capricorn, it's always striving. It's never satisfied. It's never going to be enough. Like the sort of goals that it achieves will continue to move. The goalposts will continue to move. This placement is a huge paradox in the sense that the sun tends to be our masculine drive in the very maternal and quote unquote nurturing mansion of Cancer. And then the moon that is meant to be that nurturing sense in a pretty cold and difficult environment and very sort of like practical and pragmatic environment of Capricorn. There's a lot of irony and there's a lot of paradoxes, but I also think that this brings a lot of balance. So yes, the north node there, it might be a little bit uncomfortable to tap into Capricornian qualities, but it is so part of your sort of emotional and inner world that because this placement has its very paradoxical flipped archetypes on the sun and the moon, it's a pretty interesting balance to strike. And I feel like we could break it down into into layers to go deeper into it. But essentially, a Capricorn moon does find that perhaps either their childhood, there were a lot of older people around them, or they were forced to grow up early, and just like a lack of warmth, a lack of comfort, a lack of safety in the home and childhood environment that, like I said, forced them to mature at an early age. And your North Node being there would indicate to me that, like, while this is something that you strive for in your life, especially with the Capricorn, insatiability of like the goalposts continually moving, every time you achieve something, there is this new thing that keeps pushing you forward, and it's just not satisfying. I could see there being a little bit of a discomfort in addressing the maybe lack and coldness that either came from the mother or from childhood environments that your soul does need to go towards and explore and find that balance in. But sometimes it's so much easier to remain in that Cancer consciousness that comes really naturally to you and can feel maybe more creatively inspiring with the sun there. And I know that this person also has a lot of Leo placement, so there is this sun rulership and what's called a dispositor in your other placements. And I can imagine why that would make that South Node feel even more beefy and sort of like, pull you more in that direction, because you do have a desire to have this creativity and creating a nurturing home environment for you now in this life. This is also a really great time to bring in the aspect of an opposition, and that happens on a full moon. The sun and moon are on opposite ends of the zodiac. It's also sort of when we can see that other thing very clearly. So I can imagine you can understand and see your emotions for what they are in this, like I said, Capricorn mansion, but it is an uncomfortable thing to lean towards or move towards because of that North Node presence that, yes, we're hungry for, but we need to have this level of security and safety that really is there in your Cancer South Node and Cancer Sun. So leaving that comfort zone into this Capricorn, knowing that things take time, knowing that that rewards are not going to come as easily, but there is payoff there. There is a delayed gratification there. Sometimes it's hard to want to leave the safe, nurturing, familiar cocoon of Cancer, especially with the South Node, into a more taskmaster space of Capricorn. But your moon is there. You do want some level of that achievement, and those goals can be very emotionally fulfilling for you. But it's not always the easiest path forward. Relating to this sort of fullness of the moon, I think that oppositions tend to get a bad rap. I was talking with another person I gave a reading to over the weekend about how scared they are of oppositions and squares. And this also relates to another question I got about quote unquote bad placements. And that is a very traditional astrology viewpoint, that there are bad aspects and bad placements. I see these aspects and maybe like quote unquote bad placements like a moon in its fall, like Capricorn or Scorpio, that yes, it can indicate difficult things that we need to work through, but that ultimately lead to strengths that ultimately lead us to having more at our disposal. And I say that with a moon in a quote unquote bad placement. And I love my moon and I am grateful for it. And I think that when we have oppositions in our chart or with other people, there's this element of fullness, like the full moon aspect. And I think that can be so exciting and so stimulating. A square aspect can be very action oriented and bring a lot of activity into your life. And I don't think that's always a bad thing. I think that, if we were all only to have trines or positive placements, there is a lack of wisdom that comes in when you don't have friction. And this is something that Caitlin and I talk about a lot. When there isn't that friction, perhaps of an opposition or of a square or of a bad placement, quote unquote, life would be boring. Like I actually would argue that you wouldn't, you would be bored. It reminds me of this concept that we've been talking a lot with tarot and this, relationship between Kabbalah and tarot, which is the severity to mercy spectrum. I think that when there are a lot of quote unquote severe placements, whether that's an opposition, a square, or difficult signs or, challenging placements, yes, it can lead to a rigidity, it can lead to roadblocks, it can lead to frustrations. And then you have on the other side of the spectrum, this sense of mercy or permissiveness that allows everything to flow. There aren't boundaries, and that can lead to growing illness or everything can grow, even mold and rot and all kinds of things. So it's a really good segue to talk about the relationship between Saturn and Jupiter. But I do think that on the spectrum of severity to mercy, neither of them are quote unquote right. There is always the middle way, and that is my sort of prescription for people that have oppositions or are afraid of oppositions or have this full moon aspect like my friend does who submitted this question. The lesson in your life is to strike the balance between the comfort and the sort of familiarity and ancestry and stories and all of these relationships that come with Cancer and this gestational quality that comes with Cancer to this need for structure and building and going out into the world of Capricorn. So both of those things will be imbued in your personality and your consciousness, but you will be on this path of finding the balance between the two. And because you were born in an eclipse, I'm sure a lot of those themes will come up when eclipses happen. To tie it back into this sort of severity versus mercy, we need both. We need to find that middle path. It would be insane if we let everything grow. And it would be also insane if we refined and stripped things down and sterilized things to the point that nothing could grow. So how can we find the middle path is not only the lesson in astrology with nodes, with eclipses, with full moons, it's also the lesson that comes up so much in tarot, the lesson that comes up so much in Buddhism and all of these different modalities, and it's just sort of screaming at us. So when polarities come up, this is the lesson that we need to take with us on the Fool's Journey with that 0 degree card. With that 0 degree placement, we're all on the Fool's Journey. And to quote Caitlin, this great thing that she's been saying over the past few days when we talk about the Fool's Journey, there is no right or wrong path. There is no, good or bad. There's no, I need to be severe or I need to be merciful. It's your path. It's finding your middle way. You are always on the path. Again, shout out Caitlin for that. And I've been thinking about it a lot. So it's interesting how this question brought together so many things, this 0 degree essence and this need to find a middle ground and a balance between the two. And I cannot wait to read your chart because there's so much more to say about this. And wow, you've got a gorgeous and very unique blueprint snapshot of the sky. I also want to mention with this Capricorn Cancer archetype and the sun and the moon archetype, there are many associations with the ego and the sun, and then obviously our sort of like internal fluctuating emotions with the moon. And sometimes the ego can feel a little bit more consistent. It's like more easily seen. It can be more readily projected into the world. Whereas like our internal moods and private, emotional fluctuations are less easily seen. I would also want to relate these concepts to Jung's anima and animus, because both the sun and the moon have a very strong masculine and feminine relationship, as well as Cancer and Capricorn. Cancer tends to relate to birth, motherhood, and we'll go into sort of why that is. Capricorn has a lot to do with going out into the world and kind of being this breadwinner and career-oriented, away from the home archetype. Just to sort of sum up what this placement kind of represents to me is this fusing of your conscious feminine drives and your unconscious masculine drives, how your parents show this sort of androgyny and paradox and contradiction within their relationship to you and their relationship to each other, as well as your relationship to these eclipses throughout your life. I could see a Capricorn moon on the North Node being hungry to be recognized and have these achievements that mean so much to you, but that making you feel very vulnerable and exposed, and trying to strike a balance between your comfort of your home and the creativity that's sparked there versus actually putting it out into the world, and how sort of vulnerable and how unsafe emotionally that might feel for you. So that would kind of be my summation of all of those things that we just talked about, and cannot wait to look further into your chart and we can have a great discussion on this, because your chart is very, very exciting and has so much potential in it. And consider the fool's journey. If you have a 0-degree ascendant, this is the literal sort of like moment of birth, being this stepping into the unknown and complete potential. With all that being said, let's talk about other polarities. Let's talk a little bit about Saturn and Jupiter. Like I said, I'm not super well versed in myth. It's something that I am intending to incorporate more into my work during this Saturn in the 9th house transit. I'm going inward, and I'm going on my own sort of knowledge journey, and I would love to learn more about the myths, which is like a huge reason why I wanted to do this episode, because there is so much myth embedded in these symbols in astrology. But just to sum it up, I learned about Jupiter and Saturn in this way. Shout out to my teacher, Tad. He likes to think of Jupiter and Saturn as two different types of grandparents, and they can represent your literal grandparents in your birth chart, where Saturn being the more strict and, intense and severe grandparent on the end of the severity to mercy spectrum. They are very much in the severe. They have boundaries. They want to teach you things. They want you to learn from the time that they have spent here. They want you to have patience. They want you to take your time, and you will reap the amazing things that you've sowed. Remember that Saturn, and we'll go more deep into this, but Saturn also relates to agriculture, and agriculture is very much a time-based practice that requires a lot of patience, but it always reaps benefits. It always reaps the harvest, and the seeds that you plant, they may take time, they may need to be taken care of, but they will grow. That in many ways is Saturn. And then on the other end of the spectrum, on this mercy spectrum, we have Jupiter. Jupiter is that permissive grandparent that gives you the candy, that takes you shopping, that kind of gets you whatever you want. But there's going to be a sort of excess in this relationship. There's going to be, Jupiter is known as sort of anything that it touches, especially in an astrological chart. Anything it touches, it expands, it makes bigger. And it's also the source of our wisdom. When we're thinking about the connection between severity and mercy, we're very much interacting with Saturn and Jupiter. Saturn wants to restrict. Oftentimes Saturn can constrict things from growing, and Jupiter is like, no, like, let's party. We're growing everything. Like, everyone's welcome. Let's make it bigger. The more, the merrier. But as I mentioned before, this can cause a little bit too much to grow, even some of the bad things that we don't want to grow. So again, finding that middle path there. Going back to the myth aspect, it's a very potent myth between Saturn and Jupiter. So essentially he's Cronus in Greek mythology, and Saturn is the Roman name for him. Cronus related to time, of course, as we know. And he was the sort of leader of the universe. He was the king of the gods at the time. All right, so let's just get into the basics of of the myth of Jupiter. So he's known as the sky god, the god of thunder, the god of laws, the god of social order, among many other things. And we're going to get into the really juicy, fun aspects of Jupiter. But he is the son of Saturn, so he does have this relationship to severity and mercy. And he, like many children, wanted to be the exact opposite of his father, and has also kind of absorbed a little bit of toxicity from his father. So we'll see how swinging to the opposite end of the spectrum can be less desirable. And again, that the middle path is the way to go. But Jupiter was saved by his mom when Saturn ate the rest of his siblings. And Saturn is related to Kronos. He is the Time Lord. He is the taskmaster. He ruled the universe at the time. He was the god of agriculture and civilization. And relating it back to him eating his children, there is this saying that time consumes everything that it creates. And that is, in essence, this concept of everything inevitably dies and everything will go back to where it came from in time. Saturn was also known as having civilized society, so like bringing order, bringing boundaries, bringing structure that Saturn likes to do by giving them systems, operating systems, and helping them live in accordance with time and utilize time through agriculture. So that's also how he's associated with agriculture. So this essence of delayed gifts and patience to allow your seeds to bear fruit. So when Jupiter grew up, he went back to Saturn and kind of loosened him up, got him feeling like loosey-goose, and managed to take over the throne and forced Saturn to regurgitate his siblings. The three male children of Saturn are Jupiter, Pluto, and Neptune. And then the female siblings are Juno, which became Jupiter's wife, Vesta, and Ceres. So if you are familiar with these myths, you will also start to see their associations and significations in the chart, because these are asteroids that we look at in the birth chart. Juno having to do with unity and marriage, Vesta having to do with how we keep a fire burning, an eternal fire burning, and Ceres is the Roman equivalent of Demeter, so the goddess of the harvest and agriculture, and she's also the mother of Persephone. So there's all of this like deep web that relates to all of these things, that relates all of these siblings and parents to the archetypes of the zodiac. So it's a pretty interesting rabbit hole to go into, but essentially those were the three female siblings of Jupiter: Juno, Vesta, and Ceres. And then he has obviously himself, Jupiter, Pluto, and Neptune. And so he gave himself the heavens to rule over. He gave the sea and the ocean to Neptune, and he gave the underworld to Pluto. The way that Jupiter was able to sort of loosen up his dad relates to how we see Jupiter as this person, or Jupiter as this symbol of pushing past boundaries, i.e. Saturn. In this usurping of Saturn, we also see Jupiter creating the sort of first bureaucracy, and he managed all of these cosmic affairs by incorporating his siblings and his many children. So Jupiter also has this association of just like, there's room for everybody, but it also has a lot to do with who you know. So when you relate Jupiter to bureaucracy or business or luck or money or justice, sometimes these things aren't necessarily about what you do, which relates a lot more to Saturn, but a little bit more about like who you know and who you're mingling with, because Jupiter loved to give things and give luck to the people that, were sort of appeasing him. But it's also this concept of just like, there's room for everybody and we can all contribute and feed the growth of humanity. If Saturn says no, Jupiter says yes. Saturn is the boundary. Jupiter is pushing past and making things bigger. It's, like I said, it's this sort of permissive Jupiter grandparent versus the boundaried and strict grandparent. And remember, when we go back to this severe versus merciful, sometimes we do need Saturn to give us the discipline and the patience, and Jupiter oftentimes will get us excited and bring gifts and expansion, but it doesn't always have the discipline required or the patience required. So I feel like I have a Sag Mars and I have a Sag North Node. I know a lot of people with Sagittarius and even some Pisces placements. There is this impatience and this desire to keep going and keep consuming. And we're going to talk more about that, but dog ear that and keep that in mind. Jupiter also has this reputation for being able to overcome the earthly realm, right? So he is the sky god. He is this, king of the heavens, but he also had many children with people on Earth. So his, godly genetics mixing with human genetics created these children and these people with like superhuman powers and this very charmed existence because they were able to overcome the earthly realm. And I think Jupiter kind of gains this essence of just like, there has to be something more. There is this higher power, this seeking of something beyond what's here in this tangible realm that I possess, that I believe in, and that I need to continue to move towards. So this relates a lot to when I see people who have what on paper might look like a really great Jupiter placement, So let's say, for example, you have Jupiter in the 2nd or the 4th house, but you didn't really have a stable home, or you have a lot of difficulty in your relationship to your family. So you'd think like on a surface level, you would look at Jupiter in the 4th house, oh my God, like you must have had such a lucky home and all of this stuff. And while there might be literal expressions of that, like with like Jupiter in the 4th could be like, maybe you had a big house at one point when you were a child. But like I said, if there is hardship there, remember that Jupiter shows us where we gain our wisdom. And I can imagine that if there is, Jupiter in the 2nd or Jupiter in the 4th, that you do find your wisdom and eventually your luck and your ability to overcome the hardships in that arena through seeing what you really value in the 2nd house and through seeing what these difficult home environments can teach you. Being able to see the bigger picture and make associations with something that is beyond what your physical reality shows, that's really the wisdom that can be gained with Jupiter. With Jupiter being the father of many children, I also see, as a modern astrologer, I do associate the houses with the signs and the houses with the planets of that relate to these certain things. So this might get a little heady, but I'm going to try to explain this. But essentially, the 9th house in astrology, obviously it comes right after the 8th house. It is associated with Jupiter and the sign of Sagittarius. It relates to faith and spirituality, and we'll get into more of the myth as to like why those things are attributed to that. But knowing that the 9th house is associated with Jupiter and he fathered many children. He fathered children with gods, with mortals, and he was just wanted to spread his seed and expand, right? That comes right after the 8th house, and the 8th house relates to sexual intimacy and vulnerability and death and decay. And in the lifetime astrology that I practice, the cusp of the 9th house, so the end of the 8th house right into the 9th house, is this point of conception. So we can also think that like when we become intimate with someone and when we reach this vulnerable intimacy in the 8th house, the individual dies and this like fusion of two people is born. And that is where we are conceived and create and go into this 9th house of expansion, this sort of like connection between two people and what lives beyond them, what life comes forth after something dies, and what is expanded through this unity and this death of the individual and the fusion between two that creates this new thing in the 9th house. There's also this element of Jupiter that is very much just like, how dare anybody go against, what's right, go against the law. This is also why a lot of astrologers see either people that have a lot of 9th house placements, maybe they go into law enforcement or they become lawyers, because there is this connection to law and behaving and sort of like appeasing the overlords, appeasing the gods. Jupiter was kind of spiteful. There was a period in time called the Iron Age, and I really am so bad with time periods in history, but I know that it was called the Iron Age, and humans at that time were being so foul, so nasty. They were killing each other, they were abusing each other. Jupiter was disgusted and he wanted to get back at them, and he was like, how dare they not respect the gods? That's kind of where we get that like law enforcement law, like doing what's right and wanting to, kind of act on and protect kind of like the people above us, right? This is also where it just sort of just like Jupiter's disgust in these hedonistic mortals and wanting to sort of like get back at them. And he created this great flood to like reset humanity, which is very, its relationship to Pisces and the reset before the birth of Aries and the beginning of something in Aries, but needing to wipe everything out and start over. But in this time where he was like disgusted with people in the Iron Age, and the myth goes that Prometheus stole fire from the gods so that humans could have it to fight back against Jupiter's wrath. But then he was just basically like, okay, fine, like you can have fire, but like I'm going to give you guys Pandora's box, which was like this mortal couple. And he gifted a box to Pandora, which unleashed all of the evils of the world. And it's also very much, I associate the Pandora's box and Jupiter myth, which you can look deeper in. I'm not great at explaining that one, but I do see Jupiter being the bearer of this gift as just kind of a reminder that sometimes gifts can be a bit of a Trojan horse, in the sense that we may think that something is a gift and then it ends up hindering us and kind of allowing us either to be lazy or to be hedonistic or to not try hard in a certain area. And when things just come easy to us, we don't necessarily develop the skills that we need to fine tune or to get the achievements that we want. And I think this is another example of the polarity and the contrast that Jupiter and Saturn strike with each other, which is that Saturn's lessons look very difficult on the surface and then end up being these gifts that last. Whereas Jupiter's gifts can look really great on the surface and then might actually be a hindrance to us. Because Jupiter is such a prominent god in mythology, there are so many myths surrounding him. I would say that many of the myths that relate to Jupiter also touch on the topic of going out into the world and away from society and trying to find the truth, or trying to go after something that you love or that you want, seeking something that's beyond yourself and finding things out on your own. That is a very common theme in these myths relating to Jupiter. There was also this Italian god Janus that eventually becomes conflated with Jupiter, and he was the god of bridges and connections. And this is also where we get this concept of Jupiter connecting big picture themes and opening doors and connecting things together to understand that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. This is where I really start to see the connection between Pisces and Jupiter, is this very big picture thinking and making connections to outside to the gods, making connections to the gods outside of the earthly realms, not necessarily being grounded in what's happening here, but more concerned with what's happening in the heavens and connecting humanity to what's happening there. I think for that reason, Jupiter is also a reminder of like the seen versus the unseen. So, and that's also something that I associate largely with Pisces. Pisces as a concept and as an archetype is very much just like everything unseen. And Jupiter has this essence of just like, you may not always see the gods and you may not always see spirituality, but you can feel it. And that is a Jupiterian concept of just like, I feel this urge, this pull towards something, and it's going to take me there and I need to get there. But here's the thing. Here's a big crux with Jupiter as a reminder. This phrase comes to mind, the phrase like, seek and ye shall find. I think Jupiterian people tend to have this real insatiability, this, like I keep saying, this need to go out and explore, this need to consume, whether that's knowledge, whether that's experiences, whether that's procreation, whether that's like growing your family, or, you know, just like this constant seeking. It's a desire to absorb whatever they can. Like I say, whenever Jupiter is connecting or aspecting a planet in a chart, it's going to make it bigger. It wants to absorb it. It's very, I also think of Kirby in this way. I think Jupiterian people can have this kind of like Kirby-like sense to them, where they're just like, oh, I need to like suck up and absorb this thing that I love and I want it so bad. And I think that can also bring the hedonistic association to Jupiter, where it's just like, I can't stop consuming this thing that feels good. And sometimes the more we consume of something, the more it rots within us. Like this excess, this sort of like, when you can't stop and you can't slow down. I think a lesson with a lot of Jupiter energy in a chart or in the sky is that these this consumption can catch up with us eventually. I think that constant seeking also brings us to this escapism aspect, this sort of like desire to leave the present situation, the desire to leave the earthly realm and to go be with the gods. It leads us to wanting to just be like, okay, well, what more is out there? What's next? And really struggling to stay in the present moment. And going back to that phrase, like, seek and ye shall find, what does Jupiter do when he finally gets what he was seeking? Does he sit with it? Does he absorb it? Does he integrate it? Does he learn from it? Or does he say, what's next? What happens when he finally gets his desire? What happens when he finally gets his wish? How do those acquisitions really feel? Do you still want what you so desperately wished for and sought after now that you have it? Do those gifts and do those things that you were seeking to consume, do they actually have longevity? How are they actually feeding you? And I think that's why in many ways Jupiter or Sagittarius and Pisces, sometimes we gain wisdom that the journey was way more than the destination. Like, Jupiter doesn't stop when it gets to the point that it wanted to. No, it's gonna keep going. There's always gonna be more. And that relates, in my opinion, when we associate Jupiter with like this big T truth and we associate it with laws, sometimes the laws of the world and the laws of nature and the laws of the universe aren't necessarily fair. They just simply are. And I think that constant seeking can also be applied to these finding this big T truth, like I talk about all the time, but sometimes we just keep asking like, well, what is really true? And is that answer satisfying? Now that I've gotten to the bottom of it, do I really find it satisfying? And is there even an answer? So that's the overall myth aspect. I kind of want to just share my notes and things that come up when I think about Jupiter now. This is going to be a little more abstract, but these are the lessons that I tend to associate with this placement in astrology, this planet, and incorporating all of these myths and concepts that come out from that. I feel like Jupiter tends to be the antithesis of something that holds on too strongly to certain truths. I think they do have this ability, this tendency towards like having an open mind, or even feeling like somebody else's truth is being imposed on them, and feeling a little bit motivated to contradict or prove them wrong, because they don't really appreciate that sort of like rigidity that is associated with belief systems. And like I said before, I think like a lot of the time with Jupiterian people or Jupiter placements, there is a tendency to want to find things out on your own and not just absorb what was imposed onto you. It's this notion of excess versus refinement, this materialism and hedonism and overindulgence versus being able to really utilize your gifts and not overindulge in those gifts. This is where we can kind of see a potential to take your gifts for granted and not understanding that not everybody has those gifts. And I think Jupiter then becomes really exalted when you're able to share those gifts with people. And how generous are you going to be? Trying to look at your Jupiter placement as a place for you to be generous with people is going to be very satisfying, as opposed to taking that placement for granted. This contrast between Jupiter and Saturn, we also see Jupiter, yes, being able to lift spirits and to bring confidence, but that can also lead to overextending yourself and maybe expanding and growing too quickly without having built a solid foundation or a solid system in the way that Saturn normally would, because those things tend to have more longevity. Then I also really want to bring in the concept of faith. And I think that when we have these gifts given to us, or this notion of a connection to something bigger than us, this connection to something out there, out in the cosmos that we can't see, this is where we start to associate this with faith. And not being able to see something tangibly doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Like, what can faith and trust allow people to do when they have the belief and the optimism that things will work out and that the universe or the gods will catch them? That is a very Jupiterian essence. And you do tend to go for and expand into things when you have a trust in the universe. I think this connection to Jupiter and his, birthing many children, many superhuman children with mortals, it sort of teaches us that, we might confuse a power or a gift that was given to us for something that we created ourselves, and that can create a little bit of arrogance. So something that's gifted to you from a higher power versus something that you earned is a topic that should be associated more with Jupiter, I think. But then we come back around with this sort of like ability to be humble and be in awe of this thing that you've discovered that's beyond you, that isn't just coming from you. When you believe that that gift and that source of greatness comes only from yourself, then you start to grow this arrogance and this sort of like, well, everything just works out for me and everything, the universe, like this, I create my own luck kind of concept. You need to sort of swing into that humility to understand that a lot of the times our gifts are from something way beyond what we can conceive of. I think this is again where we bring Saturn into it. Like, I think Saturn, we earn the things that Saturn tries to teach us. We earn them through hard work and through time. And I think a lot of the time when hardships come in, we gain empathy through those hardships, and we're able to understand other people's situations or other people's difficulties and other people's pain and suffering so much more. And when you are too heavy in this sort of gifts and abundance and success and things are falling into your lap, it's more likely that you'll develop a blind spot that, again, like, not everybody was gifted the same things that you were. But again, I think the beauty of Jupiter is that it does see the unity in all things, and Saturn can tend to see, the separateness and the differences between things, whereas Jupiter is like, it's all connected, man. I also just think it's interesting. I also just find it interesting how Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system, and this placement and this planet in astrology relates to things getting bigger and things growing, and the more the merrier, and sort of generosity, graciousness, receiving those gifts and those moments of mercy. And I think when we do receive these gifts and we do have these moments of mercy, there is this like wanting to thank God and wanting to like this feeling of release of just like, oh my God, I'm finally getting this windfall of something after like this moment of release, And I do think that again goes back to that 8th house, 9th house cusp of like, this culmination of sexuality and how like a release can lead to the birth of children. And I don't need to be more explicit than that, I don't think. I also want to mention, and this is something I learned from Chris Brennan, is that Jupiter has this really intense gravitational pull, and it impacts the gravity of all other planets. And I think that this is kind of where we start to feel that sort of like endless urge to go out, is because we're being pulled by Jupiter towards something. I'll talk a little bit about the Cancer and Jupiter myth, and I want to apply that to all of the things that we just discussed about Jupiter. So for the past year, since last summer, 2025, we've had Jupiter in Cancer, and Jupiter loves to be in Cancer. And I think we might be able to associate why once we hear more about the concepts behind the story behind Cancer and why we have all of these associations to it. And next, Jupiter is going to move into Leo. And every time that a planet moves into a different sign, it changes its modality and it changes its element. So it's going to have a very different energy to it. But these do relate to the two luminaries. So I think that there is a really strong connection here that I really am excited to explore. When we're thinking finally about like Jupiter versus Saturn, I want to think about growth versus decay, sort of like overindulgence and that feeling of being full versus that feeling of lack and that feeling of being hungry. What are the things that we want to deal with and what are the things that we want to go enjoy and be joyful with versus the things that we want to avoid and not look at, and that would likely teach us the lessons that we need to learn. I do think that like Saturn and Jupiter, and I honestly wasn't expecting to talk so much about Saturn on this episode, but it's such an important relief to Jupiter that I think it really gives Jupiter more context. But it's basically just like Jupiter is all the things that we want to do, and everybody wants to do it. Everybody wants to have fun. Everybody wants to party. Everybody wants to expand and, get more money and have more luck and all this stuff, but nobody really wants to have to do the work that those gifts or those things require, or nobody wants to clean up after the party, but those things have to get done. And that's where Saturn steps in. To bring it back around to this sort of wisdom and big picture thinking, I would also say that when we go out into the world, we tend to understand our own roots and our own sort of where we come from a little bit more through this contrast. And maybe that's even more apt that I've been drawing so many contrasts to Jupiter, because exponential growth is not always good. But I think that with seeking things outside of ourselves, we can gain a lot of context and understanding for the bigger picture of things instead of getting stuck and bogged down in the details of the everyday, which is way more mercurial, which in many ways is also another antithesis to Jupiter. Okay, in true Jupiter fashion, I've already been recording this episode for 2 hours and we are only halfway done with what I want to talk about. But I did just take a break. I went out to get lunch with a friend and that was lovely. I, just full disclosure, have been struggling to express myself, so it's kind of hilarious that I'm trying to record such a long podcast where I use my voice, and I just feel like my Saturn transiting through the 9th house is really hitting me, because I've just been feeling some blocks around my mind and how I express myself. So yeah, just being a little vulnerable here, and hopefully what I'm saying and what I'm expressing, the big picture will still get through. And I do think that sometimes when I'm recording these episodes, I wonder, did I say the thing I wanted to say, or did I just repeat the same thing over and over again? So we're just gonna hope that this comes across. And again, in very Jupiterian fashion, we're trying to connect some very big ideas. And there's just so much going on with Jupiter this month. So since we've talked about all of the myths and the associations that relate to Jupiter, let's move on to the sign archetypes that we are working through with Jupiter, this planet of wisdom and expansion and higher learning and exploration and seeking and faith and trust and all kinds of things that we've already gone over. And, there's just so many applications of this. So far, Jupiter has been in Cancer for the past year. Jupiter really likes to be in Cancer. It is what many traditional astrologers would call an exalted planet, an exalted placement to have. So one of the main reasons why Jupiter is what's considered exalted in Cancer in the traditional and ancient view of astrology is that with this archetype of Cancer relating to nurturing and safety and creating an environment where new things can grow, Jupiter loves for things to grow. So this is really a space where you can take a small idea and feed it and grow it and, again, to use this overly used phrase with Cancer, to nurture it into something bigger. So this brings me to something that I think a lot about when it comes to water signs in astrology, is that there is this sort of gestational, almost like pre-life aspect to them. This also relates a lot to our jungian shadow, which is that these are things that are out of sight and maybe we don't understand their influence because we can't see them, but they have a huge impact on the life that comes from them, that bursts forth from them, that begins as a seed that germinates in the darkness and in the privacy and the watery wombs of water signs. And sometimes when things get stuck and in the unseen and they don't come to light, then they can really start to become breeding grounds for some very difficult, shadowy aspects that start to control and fester. And it's a really good lesson in bringing things out of the shadows and into the light. But sometimes as I've mentioned on this before, there does need to be this germination and gestation before all life bursts forth. And it's a very sensitive and emotional and private time where those ideas begin to sprout. So that was a bit of a tangent, but the general myth that associates Cancer with all of these things relates back to Hercules. Shout out Hercules. When he was fighting this dragon whose head kept regrowing every time he cut it off, Juno, Jupiter's wife and sister, threw down this giant crab, to try to defeat Hercules during this battle. And Hercules obviously defeated this crab. In order to immortalize this crab, Juno threw it up into the stars, and that's sort of where we start to get this crab motif and relating to, defending something and associating it with motherhood and birth, because Juno in Roman mythology is associated with women, with unity, with birth, with the womb. Juno has this secondary name called like the giver of light. And this reminds me of this phrase in Spanish that when you want to describe someone giving birth, you say dar la luz, which means to give the light. And that's a very beautiful connection to Juno and Cancer and this sort of ability to bring light into the world. And I would also associate that with the reflective nature of the moon, reflecting the light of the source and connecting that to all the fluctuations and the changes that your body goes through when you go through life as a woman, whether that relates to your changing body when you become pregnant, but also all of the many different forms that the female body takes. And then this also relates to the concept of like the triple moon goddess, which there are all these different goddesses that represent different phases of the moon. So the triple moon goddess, there's the maiden or the virgin, then there's the mother. I wonder if you guys can hear the cumbia music that's playing outside of my apartment right now, but hopefully you can, honestly. So there's the maiden or the virgin, then there's the mother, and then there's the crone. And there are goddesses that are associated with this. So there's Artemis, which represents, which relates to the new moon and the first quarter moon. Then there's Selene, that relates to the full moon. And then there is Hecate, which a lot of astrologers have been using lately as like a point to look at in a chart. But this represents when Hecate, the sort of like third quarter to balsamic moon, that relates to this time when darkness starts to take over, the closing down of the light and all of the wisdom that you've gained from this cycle through life, through the moon, etc. And just sort of like accepting that we're going back into the underworld to gestate new life. The fluctuating and cyclical nature of the moon reminds us of our emotional body. It relates to women's cycles, which I talked about last episode, all of the different phases of the woman's life, and the fluctuations and changes that happen when we prepare to grow a new life. To quote Demetra George's book, Mysteries of the Dark Moon, she says, "As the sun rules the daylight of consciousness and the outer objective world, the moon rules the night of the unconscious and our inner intuitive instinctual life. The darkness and light reflect our periods of receptivity and creativity and of contemplation and action." And this reminds me of how the moon's light can represent the light that comes from a source beyond us. This light is a reflection of a divine life source, and when it is illuminated in the night sky, it's a guide for us in the darkness. And then when it's no longer reflecting that light of the sun, it forces us into the darkness and this time where we need to go inward. And I think relating this sort of like masculine consciousness of the day to the feminine receptiveness of the night, and how throughout history the sun was always represented as a masculine force and the moon always as a receptive, a cyclical feminine force. She also goes on to say, as we discuss the cycles of the moon in the remainder of this book, let us keep in mind that the symbolism revealed in the moon's phases arises from the mystery of her relationship with the sun. And I also find it interesting that Cancer as a sign comes right before the energy and the fire of the sun ruled Leo, because again, Cancer is a time of gestation that is necessary for us to burst forth with creative, conscious life force. The moon, as muse, mediates between the sun and the earth. Earth beings cannot assimilate directly the powerful energies of the sun without being consumed in the flames of this constant high voltage energy. The moon intervenes for us and distributes the sunlight in a rhythmic pattern of increase and decrease, which we experience in the tides of the ocean and the flow of women's blood. The moon's constant movement through the heavens, alternating light and dark phases, taught people that nothing remained static. All was in a state of flux, rising and falling, dying and becoming reborn. The moon came to symbolize the cycle of transformation and the capacity for one thing to change into another. I think this speaks to Jupiter's exaltation in this sign, because Jupiter, similar to the moon, hates to remain static and wants to encourage new life to burst forth. But if you remember all the things I was telling you about Jupiter, Jupiter doesn't like to stay in one place. Jupiter doesn't like to be in stasis. It wants to continue to grow, bring new life, and expand, in particular with family. I mean, back in the day, having many children was a form of wealth, and Jupiter had many children, and Cancer is the womb and our childhood and our families, and they all kind of overlap and relate in an interesting way. I think there's so much to go on about with the moon. As you guys know, I really love looking to it. I did a whole episode on it last time. And remember that Juno represents motherhood and birth and unity, and Juno is the wife of Jupiter. And I think this is where Jupiter can really thrive, when it's in this space of childbearing, family expansion, etc. So as I may have mentioned, when a planet changes from one sign to the next, they're changing not only their modality, but their element. And in this case, we're moving from receptive and feminine and fluctuating and familial and comforting Cancer into this conscious life force, this life source that the moon receives and reflects. But then the sun itself is the center of our universe. It has this masculine, linear reliability, rising and setting each day, constancy that is emblematic of this fixed fire Leo energy. And so to call back to myth, this also relates back to Hercules. There was one of the other creatures that Hercules needed to battle was this invincible lion, essentially. This lion whose skin could not be pierced. And eventually, when Hercules realized he couldn't shoot it with an arrow or, pierce it with a sword, he basically scalped this lion and wore his skin in a very prideful way as a sign of his defeat. And then to immortalize this lion, the lion was put up into the stars, as the myth goes. And that is where Leo, the zodiac, on the zodiac belt falls. And the period of Leo in the tropical zodiac happens in the peak of summer, when the heat is beating down on us and we're essentially subject to the intensity of the sun more than any other time of the year. Also, as a note, when we are thinking of the odd number signs or the odd number houses, these tend to relate with more masculine forces. The sun is this eternal fixed source of light, and it is also the giver of all life on our planet. And it's what every planet in the solar system revolves around. So in a very literal way, this is where we get comfort in being the center of attention, this ability to lead and to guide everybody, to be the creative source of life. When the sunlight comes out, we're able to see what was hidden in the dark. So this ability for this fixed sun energy to reveal the truth and to allow for divination and sort of like prophecies to come forth is also related to Greek and Roman myths, Apollo was associated with divination. There was Apollo's temple where there were all these muses, everyone was singing and dancing, and there was so much art around him. He was conflated with the original god Helios, that was the god of the sun and represented the rising and the setting. He pulled the sun through the sky. So with this sort of like oracle, divination, and all of the muses and all of the art and all of the inspiration at Apollo's temple, we begin to see why there are all these associations with light and creativity and inspiration and how that connects to the sun in mythology. It's also about like what truths can we divine by bringing light and shedding light onto these elements. In this way, the sun relieves these sort of like dark inner pains by bringing light and bringing joy and bringing inspiration and inspiring creativity and immersing yourself in the joys of life, the celebrations of life, and reminding us of this source and this center of the universe that brings life. So by allowing light to seep in, we're able to understand and to allow joy to take over. A lot of the time, with Leo placements or Leo energy in general, if you are the center of the universe, you don't always see the light that you yourself are emanating. So it's a reminder to bring yourself back to your own inner light. Yeah, I find that with Leo energy or prominent sun placements, people who are ruled by the sun, they tend to lose sight of their own inner light because they're the ones shining this creative and warm force out into the world, that they can start to only believe that they exist through validation and through an external appreciation for who they are. And they might not think that they exist without the presence of these affirmations or these validations that they seek. But it's really important for Leo placements and any sun-ruled person to remember that they are the light and they possess that inner creative force, whether or not there's an audience. Something that I like to think about a lot when I'm moving through the zodiac from one sign to another is that these are also representative of different phases of our lives. So Cancer is when we start to understand the context of our family and what we have absorbed from our family. A lot of the time, Cancer relates to stories and nostalgia and an emphasis on the past and understanding where we came from. And I talk about this often with my friends who have Cancer or fourth house associated with the sign of Cancer and the moon. With people with this placement, there is this sort of fascination with the past and your context. And typically, history relates to the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we absorb from our families, or the stories that are passed down generation through generation that connect us to something before us. And when we're talking about Cancer moving into Leo, Cancer is telling this story and wants to be the keeper of the story and wants to, establish the memory. And I'm not sure if I've said this on the podcast before or not, but the most pure memories are those that come up from a smell or a sound. The most warped memories are those that we repeat over and over again and tell ourselves over and over again. And it's very much begging us to ask this question of like, who or what is this story serving? Maybe it's holding me back. Maybe it's keeping me stuck in the past and not allowing me to go out into the world and be seen because I keep reaffirming and repeating this story. And again, it asks, who am I trying to convince? Am I keeping this story alive? Am I keeping myself or someone else comfortable through the repetition of this memory, through the repetition of this story? But again, it's really important for us to be learning from our past and gaining wisdom with Jupiter here. And I do feel like during this time that Jupiter has been in Cancer, there has been way more of an interest in the history and sort of like our familial lineages and what connects us to things from the past, and just like an overall stronger interest in what has come before us. And I think Jupiter in Cancer is really begging us to all understand that if we don't understand history and what came before us, then we're doomed to repeat it. So when we move from our childhood in Cancer, we move then into this space of Leo where we want to show off our creations. And I think I mentioned this in the last episode, where if Cancer is this gestational space, this germinating space, then Leo is where the flower bursts forth and into the sunlight, and it wants to be seen, and it wants to be exalted, and it wants to perform. There are so many layers to these archetypes. I'm trying to condense all of these things to get the most distilled and important information across about these archetypes. But I will say that because Jupiter is going to be moving into Leo and connecting with the South Node, there will be a very strong emphasis for us to look at the negative aspects that may be expanded while Jupiter in Leo is conjunct to the South Node that we need to let go of. And when we think about the more negative aspects of Leo and the sun and this ability to, yes, be a creative force, but can also scorch and can be too excessive. Like I was saying, there's this tendency to be overly prideful, overly egotistical. The sun really represents our ego and the sort of images of self that we cling to in order to gain a sort of power or a sense of self that gives us confidence, but there can be an excessiveness, like an overdoing of that. So when Jupiter conjuncts with the South Node, which it will over the span of the next year, we're going to have to evaluate, where are we being too prideful? Where are we letting our ego get in the way of pushing us forward into the future? And I talk about this a bit with the Leo Aquarius axis, but a lot of the time the lesson, especially with the Leo South Node, with Jupiter expanding it there, is going to be asking us, how can we step aside? How can our egos be put aside so that we can all move into a collective future that benefits everybody, into a future that benefits the collective? I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because now I'm starting to get back on the Leo and Aquarius nodes. That is for a whole other episode and will be super interesting, and we can really dive into that. But all of this is to say, I wanted to talk about Jupiter, and now we can apply the elements of Jupiter and the way that we seek knowledge and seek wisdom and seek things outside of ourselves, moving from this comfortable water sign that attaches us to our history and, prepares us for this bursting creative energy of Leo. How are we going to be expanding on our ability to be seen, expanding on our creative output, but also being aware of when our pride or our ego gets in the way, and how we might need to manage our desire to receive external validation. And maybe the wisdom that can be gained with Jupiter and Leo is that we don't always need this external validation, but that we are the source of light ourselves. Because remember, Jupiter is a planet where we explore and we seek out the depths of these themes. And with Leo, there's always going to be a lot of inner child and playfulness. Cancer is this mother, and it really desires to be mothered and to mother others. And I think we're starting to come out of Jupiter in Cancer, understanding that we can be our own nurturing safe spaces for ourselves. That allows us to move into Jupiter in Leo, that with that already nurtured creative force, we can feel more comfortable being seen in the world without seeking so much validation from the external. I feel like I've said a decent amount of what I want to say. There truly is so much more that come along with these archetypes. And I think while Venus is in Leo and Jupiter is in Leo, we'll start to feel this sort of surge of confidence, this active confidence and desire to be out in the world creating things, but also being seen and being regaled as a leader or as a force of nature, like the sun is. Anytime there's a lot of Leo in the sky, there's also going to be a lot of emphasis on leaders and people that are in the center of attention and out as performers or as leaders. And we'll begin to see sort of how their pride and their ego may be holding them back. I also need to bring up this very important configuration that I'm sure you will start to hear more and more about. But on July 19th, when Jupiter in Leo hits 4 degrees, it's going to create this really auspicious cradle formation in the sky that an old French astrologer named Barbot's basket. This is an astrologer a mundane astrologer who predicted a lot of huge life events. In particular, he predicted COVID happening. And one of the things he focused a lot on were these outer planets and the societal impact of them, and how they aspect each other and what that means for society. And when Jupiter hits 4 degrees of Leo, it's going to join all of these other outer planets at 4 degrees and create this sort of reset button, essentially. And the 4-degree aspect of it is this, in numerology, the 4th degree is very stable. And when all of these outer planets are aspecting each other positively, Jupiter isn't an outer planet technically, but this activation point of Jupiter through all these other outer planets, we're essentially going to see the beginning of a new age. So this is something that he predicted as being a very important moment in history, and maybe even the starting point of bringing things, of refreshing things, of renewing things. And I'm sure this is something that we've all been feeling like we're moving towards, and we may look back on this historically as a turning point of some kind. Because Jupiter is aspecting Pluto, I can imagine there is a very transformative aspect to it and a need to dig up the gold and to excavate the gold and to be honest in a very Leo way and to shed light on the sort of dark, more hidden power structures of Pluto. And because this is an opposition, like I've been talking about a lot, there is going to be an exposure of some kind and a beginning of a new sort of like balance and polarity within society that's all supported by these Neptune and Uranus aspects that they're all forming. So yeah, there's a lot to say about that, and I could easily do a whole episode on that, but keep that in mind. July 19th, this Jupiter in Leo transit is a huge part of that. And I guess just look out. And I'm going to finish the episode. This is an extremely long one. I've got my work cut out for me in editing this one, but I'm just going to read some quotes from my favorite book to discuss the fire element for us to meditate on during this Jupiter in Leo transit, and the South Node in Leo coming up, and Barbot's basket coming up, and Venus in Leo coming up. This is one of my favorite quotes that relates to Leo, because in the way that Leo can share its joy and share its excitement, when Leo is lit up, its ability to light up others and motivate others is so beautiful. And this reminds me of, I've been doing the To Be Magnetic, Be Seen challenge. And one of the things that she keeps repeating is, when I freely stop dimming my light, I give others the permission to stop dimming theirs. And I think that that's a beautiful thing to meditate on with Leo. So this is from the Mundaka Upanishad. It says, "O sun, as you shine upon my heart, so may my heart shine upon others. This is the truth. As from a blazing fire, sparks essentially akin to it fly forth by the thousands, so also, my good friend, do various beings come forth from the imperishable Brahman, and unto him again return." There's also this element, like when we think about fire, we think about this sort of ever-growing energy, which again relates back to Jupiter. This is also so Leo, because Leo rules over the heart and our heart space and our creative life force within us that pumps its blood to keep us moving each day. "Someday, after we have mastered the winds, the waves, and the tides of gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. Then, for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire." And that's from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So in my favorite book called Jungian Synchronicity in Astrology, I was reading this last night, which felt pretty synchronistic while I was preparing for this episode yesterday. And she talks about this folklore about this magic lantern. And a brief part of that goes, "I solved the riddle. It was the 4 elements, surely. The earth and the water I gave left me with less. The air I couldn't give at all. But the fire, the more I gave, the more there was to give." And she goes on to say, This little story taught me a lot, and it went on teaching me because I could use the image as an example of how you can learn to love people. You could say that we are all flames of one fire enclosed in the lanterns of various bodies with various features. Taste and affinity lead us more naturally to one kind of lamp than another. But what is important to remember is that the identical source of light, name it what you want, is in every human being. Jung happened to call it the self, but it goes by many names, and they all mean the same. So this reminds me a lot of Samhain. I'm definitely not saying that properly, but the pagan holiday that was the source of modern day Halloween. Essentially, there would be this collective bonfire, and all of the villagers would then take a piece of this source fire and light their own homes and keep it alive at their hearth. And I mentioned this on an episode of Death Club, but in Michoacan, where I'm going tomorrow actually, their Lunar New Year, that happens in February, they also perform this really special ritual where one town has been keeping one flame alive, and they bring that flame to the next town to keep that same fire going. And it's really important to continue to feed that fire and share that fire, and for everybody to take a piece of that fire home with them. And yeah, this reminds me so much of Leo energy, just this eternal flame at the center of the universe that we carry a piece of within each of us. And lastly, that relates to the goddess Vesta, which is an asteroid that you can look up in your chart and see where you are more likely to keep an eternal flame alive within yourself. So definitely check that out. The goddess Vesta relates to the hearth and relates to all these ancient themes of keeping your own creative force and light alive, and remembering that we all come from something greater than ourselves. Thank you so much for being here with me, and I have so much fun sharing all this information with you. Let me know what comes up, what questions, what ideas, what predictions. And if you want to go deeper into your own chart, please don't hesitate to book a reading with me and we can get into it together. I hope all of this Leo energy is as fun, as exciting as I know it to be. And stay tuned for more. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon. Bye.